Okay, Common Core Algebra 2. So we are nearing the end of our semester, at least this year, and we are in Chapter 4, Section 5 now. We're going to talk about solving quadratic equations again. So far we have done it three ways. We talked about solving, two ways. We've talked about solving quadratic equations by factoring and then doing the zero product property. That's when we set each one of those factors equal to 0. Last time we did the quadratic formula, which remember was identifying A, B, and C and plugging them into that formula. And today we are going to do something called the square root property. Okay, now one limitation to this I'm going to say right now is we can only do this when we have just an x squared term. Okay, so we can't do this when there's an x squared and an x. Okay, we can only do it when there is an x squared term. Okay, so steps to do the square root property. First thing we need to do is isolate the squared term. Now that could mean it's like an x squared. This would be a squared term, okay, by itself. Or it could be something like, x plus 6 and then outside square this and then equals some number. Okay, this would be isolating the squared term. We want to do that because we want to get rid of that square. And once we have it just as our squared term, we're going to square root both sides. That eliminates the square. Okay, and once we have eliminated the square, also remember when we square root both sides, there's going to need to be a plus and a minus, just like we had in our quadratic formula. So this creates two possible solutions. Remember, just like quadratic formula 2, we could have 2, 1, or 0. That 0 would actually mean two imaginary solutions, don't forget. And then we're going to finish solving for the two solutions. So on one like this, after we square rooted, we'd have to subtract 6 then, and we'd have two different solutions. One where it's negative 6 plus some number, one where it's negative 6 minus some number, just like on the quadratic formula. Okay, a couple examples here. So one of each type. We have this is our x squared term, so we want to get that by itself. And we're going to do that just like you would have done in a linear equation before this. We'd start by adding 448 to both sides. As always, we need to keep things balanced. And so we end up with 4x squared equals 448. And then we're going to divide both sides by 4. So now we have our x squared by itself over here, and that's going to end up equaling 1/12. Okay, this is the point where we're going to square root both sides so that this square and that square root cancel out and we have just an x. When we do that over here, this is where your two solutions come in. We need to have a plus and a minus square root of 1/12. Okay, and now, if you remember when we simplified radicals, the square root of 1/12 can be simplified into a perfect square and some other number. And if you went through and tried your list, you would eventually come to 16 and 7. Okay, because 16 times 7 is 1/12. And we can finish simplifying that now, keeping the plus minus 4 times the square root of 7. Okay, and that would be as simplified as we could get without writing things as a decimal. All right, remember the plus or minus. So we're going to have one where it's positive 4 square root of 7 and one where it's negative 4 square root of 7. Okay, in our other example, and I will choose a different color here, we want to isolate that piece. Okay, that's going to be our square root. So we can do that just by dividing by 4. So I'm going to have x minus 1 squared equals actually 2. And same idea, I'm going to square root both sides now because we want to get rid of that square and that square root, and we're going to end up with x minus 1, and that will equal plus or minus the square root of 2. Now this we can't simplify anymore because there is no product of a perfect square and sum of the number that gets us 2. So the square root of 2 is perfect, we're done. We just need to finish the problem by adding 1 to both sides. So we're going to have x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. Okay, so this is your solved equation. Okay, really what that means, you're done. You could write it like this. And remember what that means is where we have 1 plus the square root of 2 and 1 minus the square root of 2. Okay, we want to leave it as 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. If you were to put it in your calculator, you'd get the square root of 2 is like 1.414 or something like that. So this could actually simplify to be I believe it's 414. And this one we do minus, we get negative 0.414. Okay, so if you put it in your calculator and got decimals, you'd get those two answers. But really it's better for us to leave it just like that. Okay, and that is really it. That is our third way of solving quadratic equations. So remember, the first thing we did was factoring and then the zero product property. And then we did quadratic formula, which was just plugging in A, B, and C into that funky looking formula and then simplifying it. It looks like really messy, but remember, it was just a bunch of series of multiplications and additions and subtractions and divisions. Really just basic operations. There's just kind of several to do. And then today the square root property. But remember, we can only do the square root principle, when we have just an x squared term and there is no x squared plus or minus some x term. Okay, see you next time, guys.